So next up, we are going to pivot over to thinking about the practical realities of how we do our work and how we build our data visualization teams. Aleszu is the director of data visualization at the Urban Institute, where he provides vision, strategy, and standards for data viz at Urban, and leads a team of data viz developers who translate Urban's research and data into visual narratives for broad and diverse audiences. Previously, Bajak was an investigative data reporter at USA Today. And with that, I'll give the floor over to how I built a data visualization team from scratch.
So it's not the bottom of it.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Big kudos to everyone for putting Outlier together, for making this week full of amazing ideas and conversations. So thank you. And that's a really tough act to follow. Those last two presentations were really visceral and strong. So bear with me as I change gears a little bit, and laugh along if you need a laugh. All right. I'm not going to really plan any jokes here, though. Okay, so I wanted to start with a little bit about myself. So I've done a bunch of different things in my life. I've been a lab technician in gene therapy, injected a lot of mice. I was a professor in journalism, exploring data visualization for applications in journalism. And most recently, as Amanda said, a data reporter at USA Today. What I'm lucky enough to do right now is a bit of a changing of gears too. At the Urban Institute, I get to lead a data visualization team, two of which are here, Mitchell and Ben. If you haven't met them yet, they're up there. It's an amazing thing. Oh, I'm sorry, I am clicking, of course, on the wrong thing. So that's us on the Urban rooftop in Washington, D.C. So what's Urban? Urban is a research organization that brings together data and evidence to some of the most critical policy issues kind of being debated and legislated in America today. So I'm talking about things like upward mobility, housing affordability, education, criminal justice, childcare, healthcare. And what my team does is essentially take that work and turn it into beautiful tools, right? Beautiful tools that are useful to the stakeholders that we've interviewed and gotten feedback from, that can help inform debate, that can, as we say at Urban, elevate the debate, right? So this is everyone from, say, legislative aides on Capitol Hill to local kind of housing authority folks who are kind of working on the front lines of some of these issues. So I started this job a couple of years ago, and what I had to figure out was, well, how do we reimagine the tech stack? How do we set a vision for the data visualization strategy, the products that we were going to kind of move in the direction of? And then once I assembled the teams, I was there by myself. The previous team had left, and I had to hire 3 folks. So hopefully this talk will give you some really kind of practical tips on whether you are building your own data viz team or augmenting it, or you're looking to become a part of a data viz team, and you're looking for kind of hiring tips and those kinds of things. Or maybe trying to reposition your team within the organization. I have some tips on each of those things. So the first thing I want to tell you a little bit about is how we work. The team, so Urban Institute is 700 employees, which is pretty huge for me to kind of contend with. That means it's a lot of throughput in terms of research. My team sits on the communications department, and so what generally we're doing is we're taking research coming from the research side of the house, and we're working with them to kind of figure out what data, what evidence we want to kind of distill and bring to life. And we do it through various kind of templates, right? We use dashboards, as you can see, we use fact sheets, right? So maybe we want a drop-down menu or a map, and you can select one of 50 or one of 3,000 counties and get a kind of curated fact sheet for your jurisdiction. The other thing, of course, you've probably thought about data visualizations along this continuum, right? From exploratory to explanatory. That's a process that we take a lot of our projects through and kind of educate and talk through with our stakeholders. Okay, what could this project, what direction could this project go in? What kind of ingredients do we have to work with? And what kind of output would we like? Right? Do we want it to be a little more dashboardy without unnecessary kind of narrative thread to it? Or do we want it to be a little bit more curated, a little bit more of a clear story, right? Or clear takeaways that you're supposed to get from it. So what I needed to figure out in terms of hiring these three people who weren't with me yet was what kind of stack we were going to work in. So I did what I'd learned in journalism, and I talked to about 20, 30 people across industries, across nonprofits and journalism and private. And I asked them kind of where this was all headed. What should we be building in? The previous regime had used a lot of D3. Awesome. Raise your hand if you've touched D3. Yeah, it's difficult, right? Especially if it's vanilla D3 without any kind of helper, right? So Svelte, and talking to a lot of folks around there, Svelte.js, JavaScript framework that's relatively new, became a kind of organizing framework for the way that we were going to transition from very sloppy, messy JavaScript into something that could be reusable and very simple. So if you coded in React, that might be familiar. So of course, Svelte has a bunch of other helper tools and things that we needed to use for obviously writing our code and deploying our code to servers. But I also needed my team to be able to use a bunch of off-the-shelf tools, right? So you probably recognize some of these. Probably everyone in this room has touched one of these tools, if you haven't touched the tools on the left. So that kind of constellation of tools was something that I needed my team to be able to play with, right? A lot of our tools are custom JavaScript apps, right? We're talking about dashboards, we're talking about multiple kind of options and dynamic elements. It wasn't something that we could just use a single tool like Data Wrapper to solve, or Tableau for that reason. The last thing I want to mention about the way that we work is we had data visualization developers that in the past had basically, taken a project, worked it through their process, and then created something. But of course, we know that we don't typically work in silos, right? What this team had to be doing was, in addition to all their work that we do with exploratory data analysis and kind of prototyping, and then of course publishing and QC and all of that, was be embedded on what we call build teams. And this was actually, it's quite a luxury to have. If you've worked in a place where you don't necessarily have this support, you're ending up wearing a lot of hats and having to do a lot of this work yourself. We have, for every major project, we have a writer, a designer, a project manager, and sometimes a lot of other comm support, which are helping kind of move the trains and continue and obviously have a lot of different creative input from those different kinds of skills. So I needed my team I was going to hire to have that kind of collaborative spirit and be able to work on teams like that. It's not always easy, right, to kind of build consensus. And that's just on our communication side, much less having to build consensus with what were essentially our clients, which are the researchers. So let me tell you a little bit about who I was looking for. I was looking for folks who had, obviously, a lot of experience in JavaScript, right? We were going to together shift from very kind of very vanilla D3 to Svelte. So I needed them to be great at that kind of stuff. Something that, admittedly, I'm not very good at. And I needed them to be really great at R. So obviously, with a bunch of social science researchers at Urban, loads of them work in R. And so anything that we could do to meet them in the middle and show them that we could kind of save time, gain efficiencies in being able to go into R code, analysis code, or work with ggplot or whatever our Shiny apps that they were already creating was going to save us time in the long run. So I wanted my team to be kind of equally fluent in R. And I wanted them to obviously, have attended conferences like Outlier, or have been exposed to some of the books. This is just a selection, obviously, but have a kind of a little bit of grounding in the fundamentals of data visualization. And not just data visualization in terms of standalone charts, but as I mentioned, a lot of our tools have fancy things like drop downs, and they look like dashboards, right? You have a lot of interactive elements that all have to kind of speak to one another. And so I was hoping that they also had a little experience in user-centered design, and of course, the layout and the kind of structure of those apps. So moving from having a facility in both standalone visualizations through to what I'm calling engineered machines. I mean, these dashboards are complex beasts. They're not very simple to actually make work. And of course, we're at the Urban Institute, which does an insane amount of amazing social science work and work on public policy, economic policy, and environmental policy. I hoped that my team could with kind of get up to speed fairly quickly on some of these really complex issues. Not that it's required reading to get into these topics, right? It can take you a whole PhD to even start getting into one of these topics, but at least be comfortable having conversations with the researchers, right? On maybe the finer points of GIS mapping for this type of data, right? Or maybe how to appropriately visualize gaps in medical coverage by a sub-aggregation like race and ethnicity. And so big kudos, as I've heard already a lot this week, to John Schwabish and Alice Fang and others for the Do No Harm guide. That's something that we bring to every project, right? And that's what I wanted the team to be comfortable doing, kind of advocating for those best practices. So where did I post? Of course, the DVS Slack. I posted it on the News Nerdery Data Journalism Slack, and then I went around to a bunch of folks in my network at journalism schools and design schools. And I started getting applications, which is awesome. And I wanted to just kind of distill out 4 kind of tips that I have if you're looking for a job, and at least in the kind of data visualization that my team does, some things that I hope might be helpful. So number 1, build a portfolio. If I can't find you online or your work online, unless you send it to me, it's really hard to know what you've done and what you're capable of. So definitely put that together. Second is show, don't tell. Now maybe it's just me, but I'm like a real nerd for walking me through the process. Show me some of those sketches. Show me where the dead ends were. What didn't work about the process? Tell me, of course, about the data limitations and the biases. If you can walk me through that, I get a little bit more sense of how you approach a problem. This one I can't emphasize enough. Write a good cover letter. Okay, now my name is Aleszu. That's really hard to write and commit to memory, but if you're gonna write it to me, maybe spell my name right, and don't tell me that you're really interested in working at ExxonMobil. Say Urban Institute in the cover letter. You'd be surprised how many cover letters I get for a totally different organization that they're applying to. So yes, and if you need to use ChatGPT or something, Grammarly to check your stuff, fine. But also tell me a story, right? Tell me about why you fit at this organization, right? Not just so much about all your skills and all your awesome work that you've done, but why is it that you fit in the kind of work that we do here? And then what I recognize is that a lot of folks can't or don't have a portfolio they can publish publicly. So if you are kind of stymied by the place that you work at and you can't share those projects, then maybe there's a side project or something that you could allude to that does show off those skills. So I'm kind of frequently talking to former students and saying, okay, if you can't share it, then use the same method, but with one of the data is plural data sets or something like that to show me what you did. And so I wanted to share just 3 questions that I asked during the interview process. So where do you go for inspiration? Places like this. I'm sure everyone in this room has a really good answer for where they go. Again, walking through process, take me through, as we like to say, soup to nuts. How is it built? Collaborations, team building, that's something that I'm really interested in hearing about. And finally, what technologies you're hoping to learn in the next 6 months to 2 years. So I want to know where you're headed with this stuff. Like, what's exciting on the horizon for you? Is it something like Blender, right? Is it something that I haven't played with yet, but I really want to hear why you think it's going to revolutionize the data viz field? And so lo and behold, after 3 months, I think this was a record at Urban. 3 months, we had 3 new data viz developers hired. And so Ben and Mitchell are on the bottom right. Rachel's also on our team. And this is us in a stand-up with a guest from the Washington Post. So a couple things I wanted to mention about the data visualization kind of vision that we had to set. So it was a collaborative process, and kind of in bringing my team on, it was a kind of, I consider it a democratic and collaborative process of how we were going to re-envision the team, and then how we were going to go introduce ourselves around the organization. We had to create a bunch of materials. First off, we had to create a bunch of documentation around the Svelte components and things that we were building the starter kit. I mean, big shout out to my team who were able to put this together so quickly. I mean, we turned this place around from something that was like a bunch of, old projects that for the last 20 years kind of just like been sitting on the server without very much documentation around them, to now something that, like, if any one of us is out, like, it can be updated like that fast, right? It's just like exquisitely documented. Workflow, that collaboration I'm talking about with the writers and the designers and the other folks on our team, we've put a lot of emphasis on creating more touch points, for instance, more brainstorming, more kind of talking through mock-ups and wireframes all together to make sure we're considering things that we prioritize, right? This is an ongoing kind of struggle, right? Of how can we fit more of these checks in a compressed timeline, right? How do we make sure we're doing the best we can on accessibility? How do we make sure we're doing the best we can with mobile-first design? And that's also part of the education. So I wanted to share a couple things here where we've open sourced a lot of this too. So this documentation that we centralized on kind of internal and yet public GitHub repos is something that we're sharing around. So the next time that we encounter a project where, say, we need to share our code for optimizing something for the web, we're able to send folks across the organization to our centralized documentation. So lastly, I wanted to mention this component where we had to kind of reintroduce ourselves to the organization. This was something where I started with like hosting a bunch of like brown bag lunches with each of the centers and kind of trying to say, look at all this really cool stuff that the New York Times is doing, and wouldn't it be really cool if we could do X, Y, and Z? So that helped to an extent, but really showing them the process was the way that I found we were getting a whole lot better feedback, and we were really greasing the wheels. So it wasn't necessarily showing them what a final product was going to look like, but it was more about showing them how it is that we work so that we could build respect and rapport about how we take so seriously all of the things that they take seriously, which is, being responsible with the data. Obviously, like masking PII and personal information, stuff that we can't be publishing. So just showing them a little bit more about, we're humans who are working on this too. We're people who want to take care and also want to kind of build beautiful things that are going to, help our stakeholders engage with this. Lastly, we created a whole bunch of educational documents, right? Data handoff guidelines, like a 30-page storytelling process guide. A lot of these things that, maybe if you're working in this kind of a scenario, or if you're working with several clients, it might be helpful to have a form kind of hand-off guidelines. That's the stuff that we invested in. So this is all a bunch of like internal tooling, starter kits, and other workflows like this one for how to generate, these fact sheets. Take some of the load off of us, or if we're ever finding ourselves creating things more than once, well, let's just document it and have it and share it. So I'm almost out of time here. Just want to give you this distilled down. Number one, communicate your team's shared vision. These ideas are not mine. These ideas come from standing on the shoulders of giants across my career in data journalism, and of course, hiring a bang-up team who can help figure out this stuff all together and kind of iron it down into documents and materials. Number two, finding goals. This is kind of classic, right? Across teams to align people. Like I was saying with those brown bag lunches, showing your humanity and kind of bridging, finding common goals. And number three is something I seriously believe in, which is this exquisite documentation being at the heart of it all. Like, I don't know about you, but like if it's been 6 months, I forget how I built the thing, and it's like incredibly important for you and to show to the rest of the organization how seriously we take these things. And of course, we're ending up having to update things 6 months, 2 years down the line, so it saves us time in the long run. Last thing I just want to mention, because we're in Chicago, so like some of the senior leadership had asked us to come up with what is a TV show that best embodies the spirit of your team. And at first I was like, oh, come on, this is kind of a dumb question. But then I brought it to my team instead of just like answer for them. And I think Mitchell came up with the idea about the bear. So I thought it'd be appropriate because we're here. But I don't know if you ever, I use the analogy all the time that data viz and data journalism is a lot like cooking, right? Mise en place and having your ingredients kind of all cut up and ready. But I'd love it if people, we could have a conversation and you can think about what TV show or movie you embodies your team. So thanks so much for the invitation. Shout out to my team.
Oh, wow. All right, he's got that's a, have a mic? Hello.
Hello.
That is a line. So, Zane, let's start online today. What do we have from our online audience?
So Nick asked, as part of the communications team, do you ever struggle with translating a researcher's hyper-specific focus to something more general and approachable? If so, do you have any tips, and what is that collaboration like?
Yes.
So the question is, how do you distill the complicated things researchers want to know down into things you can communicate in your data viz?
It's a daily struggle. Is this on? Yes. It's
close to eat your mic.
Okay.
Eat your mic.
Here we go. It's a daily struggle. I think what we have going for us at Urban is that, maybe, they say like the New York Times is like an 8th grade reading level. I think we're a little bit higher. Like the expectation is this is for folks in government or folks in decision-making positions that are probably reading at a little higher level than 8th grade, which means we can kind of sneak in a little more jargon, and if all else fails, we just link, just like cite it. So we use a lot of hyperlinks to the rest of the academic literature on the issues that we're talking about.
Paying.
Finally. Okay, so this question is coming from different contexts. I really respect the Urban Institute's ambition to want to document and do know how sort of approach an initiative. And given the context of the talk that Letitia and I gave yesterday as well, and as somebody who has started my own team, what was the interview process like for you? Were you the only interviewer, and how do you account for bias in that process in your team right now?
So the question for those online is around thinking about what the interview process looks like and how Urban, and in your hiring process, you account for your own biases as potentially the only interviewer.
Yeah. So no, it definitely was not the only interviewer. I did a screening interview. Well, of course, HR does a screening interview first, and then I did one, and then we had a panel. And the panel was folks who had been up at Urban for up to 20, 30 years. So I had a lot of kind of institutional knowledge there on the panel. And remember, like I had been hired, and then basically like 3 months later, everyone else had been hired. So I was learning our institutional practices and kind of emphasis on equity and being very, trying to remove as much bias as possible. So we had the same questions asked, of course, to every single interviewee, and we had a whole system in place of kind of forms and making sure that the panelists on the interviews were asking, kind of trying to maintain that as kind of standardized as possible.
To this side.
So my question is about your handoff guidelines and maybe some documentation best practices. What do you recommend for ensuring that your team, being so close to a project, doesn't miss documenting a critical step that maybe has become inherent knowledge to your team, but when you actually hand it off to a client or to maybe an external team member, they can't put the pieces together because there's a missing piece that, when in hindsight, you and your team are like, oh yeah, we did that, but you forgot because it's become so natural to you. How do you guard against that?
So how do we miss out on like ignoring some of the tacit knowledge or things that your team does when you're documenting processes so that you get hit by a bus, you win the lottery, and you're not here tomorrow, someone else can follow that process?
Well, we've tried to immunize against that, and so I mean, a big shout out to my team for really kind of figuring out what has to go into this starter kit and what has to go into the README files for every project, so that essentially we're imagining if an intern started tomorrow, could they start this from scratch? And another thing we create is, directories within the project folders with every wrangling step. So data ingestion, any wrangling analysis, kind of transformations, all of that is kept in there too. Now, I can't speak for whether the input data is going to look the same or be in the same shape. And so that's, in many cases, a kind of missing link where we're then going and kind of speaking to those researchers saying, hey, you want to update this app, and it's been 2 years since the last app. We have to make sure the structure is exactly the same, but we've luckily documented it.
Let's go ahead and take a question off from this side. And I know are not going to get through all these great questions. So please do remember, you can add those questions on the Slack and we'll get them answered there. Off to this side.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. So I'm hiring as well through the DVS, so shameless plug out of the way there, first of all. My question is around this idea of process. So one thing I really like about Hire is that typically our questions with meeting people doesn't start with like, what tools do you use or what tech do you use? And it's usually more focused on process instead. And that's something I try to bring into the interview process as much as possible. And I suppose my question is, in an area where so many of us are freelancers doing these passion projects, a huge part of the process is actually how we work with other people. So I just wanted to see how you can try and get insights into that in what can be sometimes a quite rigid interview process. I use the word process a lot there, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, so essentially you're asking kind of, how do you keep the humanity in the interview so that you know a little bit less about tooling and process and more about how they've kind of infused themselves in that?
How they work with others while they're doing these projects.
Yeah. I mean, as I showed, I think we explicitly asked them to describe the collaborations, but it's very difficult. I mean, to be honest with you, it's very difficult to because you're getting their point of view about how that relationship went. You can get letters of recommendation, but you're never sitting in those meetings. So I try to ask the questions about kind of what hurdles they overcame. Like we all know, no project like hunky dory totally worked. Everything was great. Everyone was amazing. There's frustrations, and I try to kind of get them to walk me through that.
Zane, do we have any last question from online? We could take one more online question.
I'll make this a quick one. Do you have any recommendations for tools for people who have no code data visualization experience and want to learn how to code?
I don't know if I think I'm biased on what I learned and what I love. Like for instance, I love R, and I started with like, Tidy Tuesday and like that kind of whole community on R that on Twitter that was kind of sharing tutorials and whatnot. But don't ask me about Python. And of course, a lot of these off-the-shelf tools, I think starting with the principles is great, and then backing your way into some of the harder coding.
That sounds like a great thread to start up on Slack about what different tooling and recommendations folks have. In terms of where we are on time, I thought so. I am recognizing that we have a lot of great questions in the line, but if you could go ahead and take them over to Slack to go ahead and answer there so that we can continue to move on to the last speaker we have for our day and wrap up and head off to lunch by 1 o'clock. Again, a huge round of applause for talking about this team component.
Thank you.